Thank you, Mr. Thomas Reed, for sending us such a meaningful story by email. Today, Dust and Destiny will retell for you what he shared. A story rooted in truth, passed down from the frontier, when justice and survival often hung by the thinnest thread. They tied him to a post in the middle of the square, a rough-hewn sign slung around his neck with one single word carved in black paint: Savage. The crowd pressed closer, dust swirling at their boots. The auctioneer lifted his hammer high, and just as it was about to fall, a widow stepped forward with a voice that cut through the jeers. "Stop, I'll buy him, right now." The town was called Dry Creek, though it was more dust than creek by any measure. The place was a blistered smudge on the map of the American West, its streets carved by wagon wheels and its air heavy with sweat, whiskey, and suspicion. At high noon, the saloon doors slammed in rhythm with the clatter of spurs, and the wooden boards of the general store porch trembled beneath the weight of worn boots. Men with tobacco-stained beards leaned against the hitching posts, squinting against the punishing sun. Women, drawn more by curiosity than courage, hovered on the edges of the square, clutching the hands of their children as if those small fingers might anchor them against the ugliness unfolding before their eyes. And in the very center, chained like an animal for all to see, stood Naichi Lonehawk. He was Apache, tall, broad in the shoulders, his skin bronzed by wind and sun, his dark hair brushing against his back. Shackles dug deep into his wrists, the iron-biting flesh that had already grown raw, but he carried himself with a dignity that no chain could strip away. He did not beg, he did not plead. His silence, his very composure unsettled the crowd more than rage ever could. At his side strutted Sheriff Warren McKenna, a man who wore his badge as much for display as for duty. He had the bluster of a carnival barker, calling out charges with a voice trained to sound righteous in the ears of the restless. "Caught him stealing horses from the Matt Ranch," McKenna declared, his mustache twitching with a half-smile. "Judge ruled he's to be sold, cover damages, $50 to start, $50 for a strong back and a set of hands." A ripple of voices surged. "Savage," someone spat. "Beast," another growled. The insults flew like stones, and still Naichi did not lower his head. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the faces before him. It was the kind of gaze that made men shift uncomfortably, as if exposed. Standing at the edge of the crowd was Dale Morrison, owner of the valley's largest spread, a man whose fortune was built on swallowing up smaller ranches like a wolf snapping at lambs. He smirked, already calculating how cheaply he could buy the prisoner and how useful such muscle might be on his land. Beside him hovered Reverend Abel Blackwood, his black frock coat snapping in the hot wind. The Reverend's lips moved in constant disapproval, ready to remind the gathering that heathens and unbelievers were a stain upon their community. Between them, law and religion looked less like pillars of order and more like clubs to bludgeon the powerless. The hammer in the sheriff's hand glinted. $50, he barked again. 50, do I hear 50? The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward. Perhaps some were wary of the danger that came with owning a man like Naichi. Perhaps they simply waited for the price to fall lower, turning human dignity into a bargain. And then, from the far side of the square, a woman's voice rang out clear. "Don't hurt him." Heads turned. The crowd parted. Through the wall of onlookers strode Eliza Whitford, the widow who had run her failing ranch alone for 3 years since fever claimed her husband. She was dressed plainly in a brown dress that had seen too many washings, her auburn hair pulled tight in a bun. But it was her eyes, sharp, green, and unyielding, that drew the most notice. "I'll buy him," she said, stepping into the circle. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. She held up a worn leather purse, from which she withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth. Coins clinked as she raised it high. $70. It's everything I have. The square erupted. Gasps, laughter, outrage. "Clara, you've lost your mind!" one woman shrieked. "You can't bring a savage into your home," another spat. Sheriff McKenna's face reddened with irritation and embarrassment. Morrison sneered. Reverend Blackwood murmured of sin. But Eliza did not flinch. She met Naichi's gaze, his silence, his pride, and said words that would echo through the valley for years. Call him savage all you want. I see a man worth saving. For the first time, something shifted in Naichi's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper hidden beneath years of cruelty. The crowd didn't see it, but Eliza did. Sheriff McKenna growled, "This ain't charity, Mrs. Whitford. He's dangerous." The judge said he was to be sold. She cut him off. "I'm buying. Unless my money isn't good enough because I'm—" The sheriff stiffened, cornered by her logic. In a land still stitching together the idea of law, even he couldn't afford to be seen turning away a legal tender. With bad grace, he took her money, counted it slow, and finally shoved a key into the lock. The shackles fell from Naichi's wrists with a metallic clang that echoed like a prophecy across the wooden boards. The crowd, so loud moments before, stood in uneasy silence. The widow had bought the Apache. A line had been crossed, and every man, woman, and child present knew there would be no going back. So I ask you, as the dust of that afternoon still settles in memory, if it had been you standing in that square, would you have thrown down your last coin for a stranger despised by all? Would you have risked your standing, your safety, your very life for a principle? Because out here on the frontier, law did not always mean justice. Too often, law was only the whip of the strong. But sometimes, justice appeared in the most unlikely form, in the courage of a widow with nothing left to lose, and the silent dignity of a man chained to a post. And with the fall of those shackles, the story of Naichi Lonehawk and Eliza Whitford truly began. When the dust of the auction finally settled, Eliza Whitford led Naichi Lonehawk out of Dry Creek. She walked straight back through the murmuring crowd, her coin purse now empty, her dignity intact, and the eyes of the whole town drilling into her shoulders. Naichi followed, still silent, his wrists raw and bleeding from the shackles. They mounted borrowed horses and rode the long road west, out toward the Whitford place, a ranch once meant to be a promise of life, now reduced to a husk of broken boards and fading hopes. The Whitford ranch sat low against the horizon, its outline jagged and tired. The roof of the main house leaned, shingles curled and missing. Fences sagged drunkenly, posts gnawed by weather and neglect. The well pump had long since failed, its wooden handle hanging useless, while the barn's roof was patched with mismatched planks and tar paper. The desert wind shoved through every gap, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and mesquite, whispering of ruin. Eliza dismounted first. She turned to Naichi, her chin lifting with that same stubborn fire that had carried her through the town square. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said firmly. "Work here earns food and shelter, but I won't keep a man in chains under my roof. Not ever." Naichi regarded her in silence, then inclined his head slightly. He understood the boundary. In a land where everything had been stripped from him, dignity, even in the smallest measure, was no small gift. The first days were quiet. Naichi spoke little, and when he did, his words were deliberate, weighted. He rose before dawn and began with the well, pulling apart the rusted mechanism, setting aside the broken washers, testing the depth of the water beneath. By noon, his hands were black with grease, his back slick with sweat. Eliza watched from the porch as water finally gushed from the spout in a clean, cold stream. She found herself blinking back sudden tears at the sound. The land breathed again. From there, he moved to the fences. Each blow of his hammer rang steady, as though he had done the work 100 times before. Boards that had sagged for years were pulled straight, anchored deep. By the week's end, one section of pasture stood solid and true, as if defying the years of neglect that had threatened to consume it. The barn followed. Patched rooflines straightened, beams tightened, doors rehung. Eliza noticed the change first in the smallest creature. Dusty, the barn cat, a scrappy gray tom who trusted no stranger, one morning wound himself around Naichi's legs, purring with a sound like old machinery. Naichi crouched, rubbed the cat's ears, and for the first time, Eliza saw him smile. Not wide, not lasting, but real. Something unspoken softened in the air that day. At night, in the dim light of the oil lamp, Eliza tried conversation. She asked his name, He answered simply, "Naichi, Lone Hawk." His English was careful, accented but clear. Then he told her, piece by piece, of his past, how as a boy he was taken to a mission school where they cut his hair and beat him for speaking his tongue, how soldiers drove his family from sacred land, how his parents and younger sister were lost in violence he carried still in his chest. Eliza listened in silence, feeling the weight of his loss echo against her own. Then, haltingly, she told of Jacob, the husband fever had stolen from her 3 winters past. She described how she had sat helpless at his bedside, watching the strength seep out of him day by day, and how she had sworn to hold the ranch they built together, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Their conversations were not many, but each word laid another stone in a fragile foundation of trust. One evening, Eliza found Naichi in the corral with her old mare, a nervous creature easily spooked. He was singing softly, a low chant in Apache. The horse's ears flicked, its body stilled, and it lowered its head to his hand as though soothed by something older than language. Eliza leaned against the fence, spellbound. When he finished, he pointed upward. "Tu," he said, "water." Then he tapped the earth. "Shash, bear." Finally, he gestured to the campfire's embers. "Ko, fire." She repeated the words, clumsy but eager. He corrected her with patient humor. In that moment, a bridge was built between them, fragile but strong enough to carry hope. Another evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Eliza returned from the house with a wrapped bundle. She placed it in Naichi's hands. "This was Jacob's," she said softly. Inside lay a Colt revolver, its barrel worn but clean. "If you're to stand on this land with me, you'll need this more than I do." Naichi stared at the weapon, then at her. He did not take it lightly. Finally, he nodded. "I will not dishonor this gift." For Eliza, it was not a tool of violence, but a declaration. She trusted him with her life. In his turn, Naichi carried a small pouch hidden deep among his few belongings. Inside rested a white arrowhead, shaped by his mother's hand before the soldiers came. To his people, it was a token of protection, of connection between spirits. He had never parted with it. But each night, as he watched Eliza move with quiet determination to hold her land against collapse, he knew the day would come when he would place it in her palm. Yet even as trust grew at the ranch, in Dry Creek, whispers festered. Dale Morrison watched from afar, circling like a vulture. To him, the widow's ranch was ripe for the taking. All it needed was one mistake, one scandal, and he could buy it for pennies. Reverend Blackwood fanned the flames, preaching of sin and unnatural unions, feeding fear to his congregation. At Bradley's store, women muttered, "The widow and her Apache," as if the words themselves were poison. Only Tom Bradley, the doctor's son, showed another face. He alone greeted Eliza politely, nodding to Naichi without sneer or insult. Something in the young man's eyes hinted at curiosity, maybe even respect. Small signs, but important ones. The storm broke sooner than expected. One night, the distant thunder of hooves carried across the desert. Eliza and Naichi were already awake when the torches came into view. 6 riders, faces shadowed, laughter sharp as knives. They circled the ranch yard, shouting insults. Eliza stepped onto the porch, Jacob's shotgun in her hands. Her back was straight, her voice cold. "You'll ride off my land now." Naichi appeared at her side, tall and unflinching, the Colt resting in his belt. He did not speak, but his presence was enough. For a tense moment, the torches wavered in the darkness. Then, muttering, the riders turned their horses and vanished into the night, leaving only the stink of smoke and a promise of worse to come. Eliza lowered the shotgun slowly. She glanced at Naichi. He did not smile, but he inclined his head, as though acknowledging that this night had sealed something between them. They were no longer widow and stranger. They were 2 souls standing against the same storm, and Dry Creek would not forget it. The change came on a wind of smoke. Late one afternoon, as Naichi and Eliza mended the chicken coop, they saw a column of black rising against the pale horizon. The Garrett place lay in that direction, barely a mile away. Without words, They dropped their tools and ran. As they crested the hill, the sight clawed at their chests. The garret's barn was engulfed, the flames already roaring high, the wooden frames snapping and groaning under the fire's fury. Men shouted, women screamed, horses reared against their tethers terrified, and above it all came the piercing wail of Martha Garrett. "Emma! She's still inside!" The little girl had been playing in the hayloft when the blaze caught. Now the barn had become a furnace. Paul Garrett struggled against two men holding him back, Tom Bradley and his father, the town's doctor. "Let me go," Paul roared. "My child's in there." "You'll be dead before you reach her," Doc Bradley snapped, his voice edged with grim experience. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between terror and helplessness. And then Naichi moved. He ran without hesitation, his long strides carrying him into the fire's maw before anyone could stop him. The heat struck him like a hammer. Smoke burned his throat. But he forced his way forward, eyes stinging, heart pounding. He heard the child's coughing cries from above, and he leapt for the loft ladder, half burning beneath his hands. Behind him, the crowd fell silent. Even the jeering voices that once called him savage were stilled. All they saw was a man disappearing into fire. Moments dragged like years. The barn's roof groaned, ready to collapse. Sparks rained down. A woman sobbed into her apron. Then, through the black smoke, Naichi emerged. Emma Garrett clutched in his arms. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair singed, but she was alive. Naichi staggered forward, shielding her with his body as a beam crashed down behind him, the explosion of timbers echoing like gunfire. He burst into the open, stumbled, then stood tall, handing the coughing child into her mother's arms. Martha collapsed around Emma, sobbing with relief. Doc Bradley pressed to examine the girl, nodding quickly. "She breathes," he said. "Scared, but she'll live." The crowd erupted, not in jeers, but in stunned silence that bordered on reverence. Eliza, her hands shaking, stepped forward. Her voice carried, calm and steady. "This is Naichi. His name is Naichi Lonehawk." The words, so simple, cut like a knife through the years of slurs and suspicion. Paul Garrett, his face streaked with tears and ash, approached. For a moment he only stared, then extended his hand. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I said things I regret. You saved my daughter's life. For that, I owe you more than I can repay." Naichi clasped the man's hand firmly, without words. Even Prudence Patterson, the banker's wife who had once been the sharpest tongue in Dry Creek, stepped forward. Her face flushed, her words halting. "Mr. Lonehawk, thank you for Emma, for reminding us that sometimes we don't see clearly." For the first time, she did not look at Eliza with disdain. Later that evening, a wagon rumbled into the Whitford yard. Lars and Ingrid Olsen, the Norwegian farmers who lived 2 miles north, climbed down. Lars unloaded sacks of flour, salt, and cured pork, while Ingrid pressed a bundle of seeds into Eliza's hands. "For your spring garden," she said in her heavy accent. Then Lars produced a battered rifle, its stock worn smooth by use. "A good man deserves a fence and a gun," he said. "Take it, neighbors stand together." The turning point came quickly. With the Garrett barn lost, the town decided upon an old tradition, a barn raising. By the weekend, men and women gathered in the clearing with timber and tools, ready to rebuild. It was Naichi who took the lead. Without bluster, without demand, he laid out the plan, marking beams, instructing men where to cut and how to fit the joints. The skills of his people, who built lodges to withstand storm and snow, translated to the heavy timbers. His calm authority was unmistakable. "Steady," he called. "Lift together, anchor deep." For the first time, the men of Dry Creek followed him. They did not question. They saw his hands, calloused and sure. They saw his courage, still raw in memory from the fire. And they obeyed. By noon, the frame stood high, a skeleton of strength against the sky. As they gathered for the midday meal, sweat running down their faces, Naichi stood before them. He spoke slowly, each word chosen. "We are different, different words, different songs. But we share the same sun, same rain, same need for harvest, same love for children." No one replied at first. Then, without prompting, hands began to clap. It started with old Lars Olsen, his weathered palms striking together. Then Tom Bradley. Then more. Soon the sound rolled through the gathering like thunder. Respect had been earned, not by speeches, but by deeds. That night, back at the Whitford Ranch, Eliza spread her one good tablecloth and lit 2 candles. She served stew and cornbread, simple but prepared with care. When they sat, she raised her glass. "To Emma Garrett's safe return," she said, "and to new beginnings." Naichi nodded once, then reached for the pouch he had carried since boyhood. From it he drew the white arrowhead, smooth and gleaming under the candlelight. He placed it gently in Eliza's hand. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "She made it for me, to protect, to connect. I give it now, to the one who saw the man in me." Eliza closed her fingers around the stone, her throat too tight for words. The candle flames flickered between them, carrying the weight of promises unspoken. And then, hesitantly, she leaned forward. Their lips met in the gentlest of kisses, light as desert wind, brief as a vow whispered under the stars. It was not possession, it was recognition, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. Outside, the prairie stretched into darkness, coyotes calling in the distance. But inside the Whitford house, 2 lives, once shattered, once despised, had begun to weave themselves into a single thread. Dale Morrison had not slept well since the Garrett barn raising. He had stood on the edge of the crowd that day, his jaw clenched, watching neighbors clap Naichi Lonehawk on the back as if he were one of them. A barn had gone up, true, but Morrison felt something far more dangerous had been built that afternoon. Respect. Respect for an Apache, respect for a widow who refused to sell. That was poison to a man like him, whose power thrived on fear and debt. He rode back to his ranch with his men and made plans. If Eliza Whitford would not surrender her land willingly, he would strangle her into it. Water could be fouled, fences cut, livestock frightened off. A ranch could not live long without its veins intact. And in town, Reverend Abel Blackwood fanned the flames. Each Sunday he pounded his pulpit with white-knuckled fists, thundering about the natural order. He warned his flock that a woman sharing her table with a heathen was a sin that would bring God's wrath upon the valley. But more and more the pews shifted uneasily. Some still nodded along, but others remembered the sight of Naichi carrying Emma Garrett out of fire. Memory is stubborn, and Blackwood's firebrand sermons began to sputter against it. Morrison tried subtler strikes. One night, Eliza's old mare nearly broke a leg in a steel trap hidden near the edge of her pasture. Only Naichi's quick hand saved the animal. Another morning, they found the north fence sliced clean through in the night. And one evening, when Naichi went to draw water, the well churned up mud and filth, rocks and refuse deliberately thrown in to poison it. Each act carried the stink of deliberate sabotage, but proving it in a land where wealth bent law was another matter. Sheriff Warren McKenna felt the squeeze. He had stood in Dry Creek Square, seen the courage of Eliza, seen the dignity of Naichi, and most of all, seen how the town shifted after Emma Garrett's rescue. But Morrison's money lined half the county. McKenna walked a narrow line, his badge heavy on his chest. The turning came when Eliza marched into the sheriff's office carrying the steel trap. "Look close," she said. Her voice was cold, her eyes steady. "See the mark there, scratched initials? R.H., that's Raymond Hutchkins, Morrison's foreman." McKenna turned the trap in his hands, jaw tightening. "This is proof enough," he said at last. He signed the order to detain Hutchkins, though the ink felt like fire under his pen. Outside, Reverend Blackwood bellowed on the courthouse steps, condemning the godless Apache and demanding order. But the crowd that gathered no longer roared its agreement. They had seen too much with their own eyes, and silence can be louder than applause. Still, Morrison did not stop. Late one night, Naichi heard the faint jingle of spurs carried by the wind. He rose, Colt at his side, and stepped into the dark. In the starlight he saw them, Morrison in a clutch of his hired hands, setting hay alight in the distant field, trying to stage another fire, one they could blame on him. It was a trick as old as lies. Create the danger, then claim the savage caused it. Naichi could have fired. Instead, he raised the revolver and sent a single shot high, cracking through the night sky. Then he grabbed the iron triangle that hung by the corral and struck it hard. The clang carried far across the valley, a sound every rancher knew. Trouble. Come quick. Lights blinked awake in the distance. Lanterns bobbed. Horses were saddled. Neighbors rode in. When they reached the Whitford place, they found Morrison caught in the open, his men still clutching torches, their lies stripped bare. For once, the rancher had no words. His sneer faltered under the weight of a dozen watching eyes. Reverend Blackwood, who had slunk after them in hopes of righteous spectacle, turned pale. Even his voice failed when no one echoed his condemnations. Sheriff McKenna arrived, jaw set. For the first time in his tenure, he squared his shoulders not to money, not to influence, but to truth. "I'll say it plain," he declared, his voice carrying. "In Dry Creek, justice is no longer for sale. From this day forward, it will not be auctioned to the highest bidder." The words fell like a verdict. Morrison muttered, but no one followed him. Blackwood stepped back into the shadows, and in that moment, something in Dry Creek shifted on its axis. Naichi had not fired into flesh. He had not met violence with violence. He had simply called the town to witness, and witness they had. After the dust settled, the nights grew quiet again. On the Whitford porch, Eliza and Naichi sat with tin cups of coffee, watching the desert stars blink cold above them. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, of survival, of stubbornness, of something gentler they both felt but could not yet name. The air smelled different that evening. The desert wind, once dry with sage and mesquite, carried something softer like flour sifted fresh for bread. For Eliza, it was the first time her land had felt sweet in years. The peace was interrupted only by the arrival of Tom Bradley, riding up in the dusk. He carried a folded letter. "Mrs. Whitford, Mr. Lone Hawk," he said, awkward but earnest. "I've been thinking about all I've seen. I want to learn. Horses, building, maybe even learning to see people the way he does." He glanced at Naichi with respect, not pity. "If you'll let me, I'd like to apprentice here." Eliza and Naichi exchanged a glance. Perhaps this was the truest measure of change. Not just survival, not just grudging respect, but the desire of the young to learn a new way. And yet, a question hung in the cooling air, unspoken but heavy. Was Dry Creek truly changing? Or was it only gratitude, a passing debt owed for one saved child, one raised barn, one night when truth was louder than lies? So I ask you now, do you believe the change of Dry Creek was genuine, or was it fleeting, born only of circumstance? And tell me, does justice endure more when held at the point of a gun, or when a community stands together to defend it? The story of Dry Creek does not end with gunfire or with a final ride into the horizon. It ends the way real lives do, quietly, with dawn light spilling across a land that has been scarred yet still breathes. Justice and honor had found their measure there. Eliza Whitford stood against a crooked law that would have sold a man like cattle. And by doing so, she preserved not only Naichi Lone Hawk's dignity, but the dignity of the town itself. The lesson was plain. Sometimes law and justice walk side by side, but sometimes the law is only the whip of the powerful. When that happens, it takes someone willing to risk everything to remind others of the difference. There was rescue and sacrifice woven through their days as well. Naichi carried little Emma Garrett from fire, but in truth, he was rescuing more than a child. In her frightened eyes, he saw his own worth returned to him, and in saving her, he saved his own heart from turning to stone. Eliza, too, gave rescue. She pulled Naichi from the chains of the word savage, and in return, she herself was lifted from years of loneliness. Two lives that might have withered separately began to grow strong together. And though no miracle turned Dry Creek into a paradise overnight, there was redemption, there was transformation. A community that once jeered now raised beams under Naichi's direction. The same men who spat at him now passed him buckets of water, hammered timbers at his command. and asked him questions about horses and land. Hatred does not vanish in a single season, but the path of a town can shift, and Dry Creek had begun to turn. In the Old West, wisdom was often short, blunt, and hard-won. A saying was passed among the settlers, and it fits this tale well. On the frontier, a man is measured by what he does in the moment of need, not by the noise he makes before the crowd. Another truth lingers. The law can build fences, but only the hearts of people can build a town. So imagine the picture. Dawn rolls over the mesas and the cottonwoods. The first silver light pours across Eliza's porch. Around her neck hangs a white arrowhead, its smooth surface catching the glow, a token of protection and connection from Naichi's own mother. In the yard, Naichi tightens the saddle cinch, readying for another day's labor. The sound of cowbells drifts faintly through the air, the valley waking to ordinary chores. But one thing has changed forever. No voice in Dry Creek dares call him savage anymore. They call him by his name, Naichi. And that is where this story leaves us, at a dawn both fragile and enduring, where two people held their ground against hatred and by their courage forced a town to look itself in the mirror. So, once again, we thank Mr. Thomas Reed for sending us this remarkable story by email, allowing Dust and Destiny to share it with you. If you found something of value in these events, we ask you kindly, follow this channel, share it with those who might listen, press like, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what do you believe truly changed Dry Creek? And tell us this. Would you be willing to pay a price to see the humanity in another person, even when the world refuses to? And if you carry a story of your own, of honor, of justice, of sacrifice, send it to us. The old frontier is long, and there are still many tales waiting to be told.